Anthropology is the study of human beings. Short and sweet. All human beings. In the past, in the present, in the future. It's the study of our behavior. It's the study of our culture, the way we think, the way we act, what we build. Can you get a little more holistic than this, please? No, it's pretty big. And you're having a series of speakers that kind of test the idea of what is science and how do you approach science. And anthropology is a social science, and it's considered one of the more scientific of the social sciences. But it's also considered one of the more humanistic of the social sciences. And the differences between the two, and I won't bore you too much with the philosophy of science behind them, but I think it's really important to understand, is that in the humanities, things like English and philosophy and history or ethnic studies, where you're looking at the literature of, for example, I teach a course on Native Americans, and we look at the literature of and by Native Americans. Communication studies, understanding what people say, the great speeches of the world. All of those things are trying to look deeply into somebody else's mind and build a bridge of understanding. So, I don't know if you've ever had that experience, if you're geeky enough, if you're a humanistic geeky type, but have you ever read a poem or read a short story or seen a film that went, whoa, I now understand things in a completely different way. It changes the way you feel and think about the world. That's what the humanities do. The sciences have a different purpose. The sciences try to help us understand not so much here in the heart, but here in the head. You know, what causes behavior? What causes change? Those are really the kinds of things we do. And the scientific realms in social science that are considered scientific include what you had last week from Dr. Cooper, psychology. Could you recognize the science when he was talking? All the brain stuff and chemistry and experiments. Very, very sciencey. Sociology, which uses a lot of survey methods. Political science, environmental studies, and of course, once again, anthropology. So anthropology is a little bit humanistic and a little bit scientific. So when we're asked the question about nature and nurture, it's like I feel a little bit like a schizophrenic trying to say, which part of my anthropology are you asking this question to? The part that understands or the part that questions? So just bear that in mind as we talk about this deeper question of nature and nurture. And there are a whole bunch of different ways the social sciences accumulates information. And again, this is not a methods class, so I don't want to go deeply into that, but to understand, because how many of you are taking a critical thinking class this semester? A bunch of you. How many are taking critical thinking next semester? How about next year? Okay, that should be every hand in this room should be up at one point or another, because critical thinking is something you have to take. But understanding how that information came to us is important for your understanding of how good is that information. You know, where did it come from? Did it come from people asking questions? Now, when you ask people questions, how much do you trust that answer? Think about it. If somebody asks you a question, okay, let me give you a classic situation. This was actually an experiment that was done in Arizona. Somebody knocks on your door. Of course, you're all under 21, so I know, or many of you are, so I know how you're going to answer it. So somebody opens the door and asks, how many bottles of beer do you drink in a week? What would you answer? 0. Of course you're going to answer 0. And if you're over 21, what might you say? You might still say 0, or you'll say, oh, I have a beer on the weekend. And then this same group of people went into people's garbage cans. It's really cool. We call it garbage archaeology. They went into their garbage cans, they opened up their garbage cans and they looked. And what do you think they found? Beer bottles, beer cans, yes. So when you ask people questions, they don't always tell you the truth. Now, it isn't necessarily that they're overtly lying to you, because they may actually believe their answer at the time they're telling it, especially when people are recalling food. So if any of you have ever been on a diet and you're supposed to write down everything you had to eat, somehow a whole bunch of things just never get written down. It isn't exactly because you're lying, except perhaps to yourself. And we do that all the time. So asking people questions has some limits. Observing kind of takes the lid off of those limits. Now, there are multiple ways to observe. You can observe people in their natural environment, and as an anthropologist, that's what I do. I go into people's lives and I hang out with them. And I hang out with them long enough that eventually they stop treating me like a guest and start behaving normally. In which case I kind of see how they live. I can ask them questions, but it's always good if I'm asking questions to kind of back that up with an observation. Now, in anthropology, we don't do very much on this other side that goes experimentation. I don't tend to put people in an experiment. I try to look for natural experiments. So for example, when I was a wee thing, and that was true, that happened once. There was once a time when I was young. When I was a young anthropologist and I went on my first field trip into South America, and I went into the rainforest and hung out with this tribal society. One of the first things I did was look for what are the natural experiments going on in this society. I can't do anything to them because that wouldn't be ethical. But I could see what has happened to them. For example, the village I stayed in, for the first time, had a road built into it. This is in Suriname, in South America. A road built to the capital city, which almost no one has ever heard of. Has anyone ever heard of Paramaribo? I'm used to this. So a road from the main capital to this little village of 250 people. Natural experiment. For the first time, within 8 hours, you could get stuff. And so they were getting stuff. They were getting sugar and Coke and Pringles potato chips. And this was a village where everything was built by hand before. So there's a natural experiment. I was there when the first marijuana cigarette made it to the village. So that was a natural experiment. I could see, well, how did people react? What did they do? I could not bring it and give it to people and say, okay, how is this going to change your culture? So in many ways, many of my techniques that I use as an anthropologist are humanistic. I immerse myself in the culture, I read about things. For many cultures, I might dive into what did they write, what is the poetry they create, the songs they sing, the art that they make. But I also want to include structured observation, some surveys and statistical analysis, and then look at and read the kinds of things that Bob Cooper does, because he's a social psychologist, and so he will look at experimentation. So that's why I'm here, because I do that kind of social science. Now, you guys last week saw a film called Babies, and Babies had no narration. Did you notice that? They didn't tell you stuff, they showed you things. And that is the way you experience things as an anthropologist. People don't come in and tell you, this is what we're doing. You know, they do stuff, and then you ask them, what are you doing? And then they tell you about it. But there's no narration in real life, unless, you know, you're schizophrenic. But there's no narration in real life. And so I wanted to show you something that was in the style of my personal hero, who died long before probably even, maybe even some of your older siblings were born. Margaret Mead, one of the great anthropologists of the 20th century, who used to put together visual films like the one you saw, showing different cultures side by side. What do mothers do? What do fathers do? What do children do? How do you make a canoe in 5 different cultures? To have that sense of comparison, so that you could see what seems normal to you, but also what doesn't seem normal to you. And that's the experience you probably had. Now, one of the babies was in San Francisco. Did she seem kind of normal to you? The way those parents acted, that seemed kind of normal? It should have, because that's your culture. That may not be your distinct individual culture and your family experience, but you know, it was filmed 50 minutes from here. But what about the other cultures? What about Tokyo? How did that one seem to you? Was that familiar? Yes and no. I mean, after all, it had busy streets, it had buildings, people lived indoors. It was heavily what we call in the biz, in my biz, the built environment. That is to say, did you see that many shots of the little kid in Tokyo outside of a building? No, they live in a city. And you kind of live in a suburban city-ish place. So there's a lot there that is in common. In my field, for example, and Bob Cooper loves this test, if you take a test and it's a test of perception, and it's a test of perception about how long, how oriented these lines are, and you give it to somebody in Tokyo or San Francisco, they can pass that perception test really easily because they live in a world of corners. Look at this room. How many squares and corners do you see? It's like a lot. Now think about that family in Namibia and Mongolia. How many corners did you see in their lives? Namibia was the one in Africa, Mongolia in Asia. Did you see a lot of corners? No, they're living in round places with organic, natural things. If you give perceptive tests to the people who don't live in a built environment, they literally see the world differently than the people who live in a more organic environment. So you guys have a lot more in common with the little Japanese family than you imagined. So we want to think, we want to observe, compare those different cultures, and then reflect on some of those differences. Now, you had a study guide to kind of look at, and some of you may have looked at it, but I want you to reflect now, observe, compare, reflect. Some of you may not have felt very comfortable with how you saw those babies live. And I want you to take a minute, and you know, it's really hard to do this, the classic active learning thing in a room of 500 people. So it's going to get really noisy for about the next 3 minutes, but I'd like you to grab the people right next to you and share one thing that really disturbed you about this film. So just share it with each other, take a minute. Now, what brave souls will be willing to share one of the things? I overheard a few things. I can start with sharing mine. Now, by the way, culture shock doesn't mean that you are being judgmental and that you don't understand why the culture is doing that. It just means that at a visceral level, you were startled. So for example, my moment at a visceral level was when the rooster jumped on the little bed in Mongolia and was crawling along the kid, right next on the bed for the kid, and that may be because roosters scare me. And I was thinking, roosters, they've got those claws, oh my gosh, what if it steps on the baby? Oh. That was a visceral thing. It doesn't mean that I don't understand that people are living with livestock and that you interact really closely with your livestock on a cognitive level. I grew up in Fresno. I know livestock. So it's not as if I don't know that happens, but it went wham. And that made me realize what city assumptions I have about babies. That in my culture, we keep babies safe. That's an assumption. And that rooster violated that. I heard another one about the shaving of the head with the razor. That was another moment where you kind of went, now why did that grab you here? It's dangerous. Once again, safety. Babies are safe. What other observations? One more share on that. Anybody want to share what they observed, compared, and reflected? Okay, you guys did it with each other, that's fine. But I want you to begin to realize that that is a teachable moment to yourself. That when you travel or experience your neighbors that are from a different culture or encounter anyone from another culture and you have that moment of going, whoa, I didn't expect that. That tells you something not only about the other culture, but if you suspend your judgment and kind of listen to yourself, you can understand something about your own culture as well. And that is a really powerful moment. That's why anthropologists like to immerse themselves. And by the way, the reason I wasn't here last week is because I was at Google, immersing myself in Google culture. Because I'm doing a project with Google. And believe me, they are as alien as anything in Namibia. So, what did you think about men's and women's roles? What did you see about them? And I'm not going to ask you to volunteer to tell me what you saw. But what did you see that you expected to see? What did you see that you did not expect to see? And I can tell you something that I saw, partly because I've read a review of the film from a Japanese anthropologist who said, Japanese fathers helping with the baby? Whoa, that's not very common. And culturally speaking, statistically speaking, it wouldn't be. But it is beginning to happen. A new fatherhood role is developing in urban Japan, helping with the babies. So you want to think about who helps with the babies, who doesn't help with the babies, who cleans the little dirty butts, who doesn't. Those are all important aspects of the learned behavior of gender. Now, what is one of the most important things that you first thought about those babies? Or let me ask it a different way. If you've ever known anyone who's had a baby, what is the first question you ask when that baby is born? Even before the name. Is it a boy or a girl? Because that is a critically important piece of cultural information. Because until you know that, you don't know how to treat the boy or the girl. You certainly don't know how to knit for them. That's not all your problems, but it's always mine. It's like, oh, what if I knit the wrong color? And I knit that baby boy something brilliant pink. It will distort and warp that poor child forever. But what kind of toys you buy for that child, you do recognize I'm being sarcastic. I just thought I'd identify that. What kind of toys you buy, how you interact. Do you pick up a little girl and go, oh, we're gonna play football now? You know, so we have a whole set of cultural expectations around gender, but is that person's gender social or biological? That's a trick question, by the way, but I'm going to ask it. And I'll ask it again next week. What do you think? How many people think gender is biological? Stand up. No, seriously, stand up. How many people think gender is social? Stand up. How many think it's both? Stand up. Okay, great. And I just heard down here a brilliant insight, which is the sex may be biological, but the gender is sociological. Now, it's often pretty complicated, but we have that biological given. You're born with certain genetic equipment and certain biological equipment. The two mostly match. But you're also born with a series of culturally defined expectations. So there is an example of thinking about that distinction between biology and what is learned by nature and nurture. And then I wanted you also to think about the learned environment. Those are very different cultures. In Namibia, they're as close to the long track of human history as we have on the planet in the 21st century. I mean, most of our time as a species was spent being foragers. It was spent living like those guys in Namibia. Most of our history as a species. We've only had a short time in our history as a species, only really depending on the place, maybe say 5 to 10,000 years, some places as little as, a few hundred years, living with agriculture and in cities and towns. And so the pastoral experience of herding animals that you saw in Mongolia, that's not very old. That's only about 8,000 years old. And the cities that you saw, well, that's an even more recent experience in human history. So you're seeing some very different kinds of built environment. And notice how you felt, what your visceral reaction was to an environment which is radically different than the one you know is normal. It's, the little culture shock of, oh, wait a minute. You don't have actually a lot of water in Namibia for constant baths, and there's a fly problem, and the best, most logical way to deal with the fly problem is to cover yourself with mud. Do we do that? No, and that actually violates the other hidden principle about children, which is we keep them clean. But clean doesn't always work in all cultures. So I want you to hold those thoughts in your mind. Now, when we think about behavior in social science, there are a couple of different orientations I want us to think about. Mostly, we identify a behavior, we count things around that behavior or that variable, and then we organize that information. So, for example, if we tell me something associated with the gender female. Give me a variable. Pink. So, and I will take that as color, say color acuity. For example, if we were to do a linguistic exercise and ask men and ask women to identify particular colors, women can identify a far more nuanced range of colors. We have words for things that most men are not willing to use the word magenta, and lavender, and periwinkle. I am wearing periwinkle today. How many men would have said, oh, I love your periwinkle outfit? And the accents are excellent. So there is a behavior associated with gender. We count that. We see how many men use periwinkle in the course of identifying colors. We put that through a statistical program and we make a normal curve. We look at a single factor and we make that little bell-shaped curve. Some people, like the norm for men using the word periwinkle would probably be relatively small. But some would use it a lot. We would probably call those men artists. And some wouldn't go, huh? They would be on the other end of the bell curve. So one thing we do in social science when looking at this nature and nurture divide on any variable is we look at the distribution of that variable across a normal curve. It's very hard to get that information. It's hard to pull out a single variable in human behavior. So we stack a lot of those up. And that's why I gave you the topography image on the other side, because I think often what makes social science so complicated and demanding is that we aren't dealing with things one variable at a time, we're looking at many variables at a time. And because we're really looking more at a topography of factors rather than a single bell-shaped curve. So our scientific analysis becomes very, very complicated and very controversial because sometimes it's really, really hard to separate our variables out from each other. So we have a lot of differences that we make relevant, and I'm checking my time here. And we've just talked about one, and we'll continue to talk about it. You'll continue to think about it probably until the time you take your last breath, which is gender, and how gender affects the way we're human and treat each other. But there are also some other significant things that we have invented as a species to make differences that we think matter. And one of the most important ones is race. It's a relatively recent invention in human culture. We actually haven't used race as a variable to judge each other for all that long. Most of the time we use language or culture or location of origin. But race as a concept is actually only about 500 years old. But boy, have we taken that and used it across this planet. Culture, ethnicity, we use those to identify differences that matter. Nationality, another one that's of relatively recent human origin. I mean, people lived in kingdoms, people lived in empires, but mostly people just lived in villages and didn't really think of themselves as citizens of South Africa or citizens of France. That is a relatively recent thing in human history, but those are things that we have created to separate each other. Now, I want to make something, and this is like a semester's worth of anthropology in 50 minutes, but one of the things that's really fascinating to me is that we've created these things, and it's a dual-edged sword. Because belonging to a gender or a race or an ethnicity or a nationality, that has a positive view. Because after all, if you belong to something, how do you feel when you belong to something? Does it feel good to belong to something? You kind of know what your expectations are. You kind of feel like, oh yes, I love being in it. Nothing makes me feel happier about being American than being outside of America. For those of you who've traveled, you know what I mean. It's like, okay, watch the daily news, read the newspaper, and think, oh my God, I'm too old to immigrate. Too bad for me. But when I leave the United States, I go, oh wow, I'd forgotten about all the things I can be and do as an American that I can't be or do somewhere else. And I really kind of fall in love, and I come back and I really want a Big Mac more than anything in the world. So that is a natural thing that humans do. We create these categories of belonging and we inhabit them. But we also use them to judge each other. We also use them to say, these are not without power as the basis of them. So genders, okay, I'm going to ask your loaded question of the day. Are the genders equal? Yeah, let me ask that a different way. In a philosophical sense, do you think genders are equal? Yes. Yes, ma'am. Okay. In a practical sense, do we treat genders as equal? No. Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, I wish I could be in your world. But practically speaking, human beings create these categories, turn them into groups, and treat those groups differently. And power is part of that. Now, is that a natural or a nurturing tendency? Well, it kind of depends. And human beings have the capacity to have dominance over each other in almost every society. But in some cultures, it's very, very mild. In some small hunting, gathering, foraging cultures, people are almost exactly equal. You really only see differences that are differences of, say, talent. That someone is really good at art, or really good at making chipstone tools, or really good at making a crack porridge. But they're not necessarily different in any categorical way. Like, oh, that family is better than that family. But in other societies, as your societies get bigger and bigger and bigger, that power becomes more and more important in quickly defining each other. So, frosh, sophomores, juniors, seniors, you know, we can create a category like that, put people in it, judge them, and treat them differently. That is, in part of the human experience, but it's something that is different in almost every culture. And if it's different in almost every culture, do you think that's inborn? That's a tricky one. I just want you to reflect on that, because we'll probably pick that one up again next week. And a lot of it has to do with a category that the sociologists call birth ascription. So in other words, you are ascribed an identity when you are born. First question you ask, boy or girl? That's birth ascribed. Generally, that's ascribed at birth. Now, not always. There's a small percentage in which it is unclear whether you're male or female, and it's really difficult. And they try to make you male or make you female. And that is by the way they treat you, and by perhaps surgery. But that's a tiny, tiny minority. Most of it's birth ascribed. How about your race? Is that birth ascribed? Is your race there when you are born? Yes and no. What parts are yes? I mean, because frankly, babies look a lot like each other no matter what their race is. They all look like Winston Churchill has gone through a blender. You know, that was perhaps not diplomatically said, but you know, it's not like phenotype, how you appear, is that dramatic when you're a baby. So what do we look for to determine your race? Your parents. So we're looking at birth description. We're defining you at birth. One of the really interesting things that anthropologists are playing with now is the new capacity to do something like 23andMe. Have any of you heard of 23andMe? That does your personal genome. I've had it done. I've had my family have it done. The wife of one of the founders of Google founded 23andMe, and you can get your genome, and the first thing they tell you, besides whether or not you're predisposed to certain diseases, is your ancestry. And they will have a little thing that flashes up and says, African American, European, Native American. It will tell you your race based on genetics. But the assumptions are huge about which genetic trait is associated with a race. Like Native American, that's what mine pops up on. And that one is really confused because for part of Native American, they can't tell the difference between Native American and Asian. Because genetically, we're kind of identical. You know why? Where the Native Americans come from ancestrally? Asia. So it's really kind of hard to count that. So when you're looking at Latino, who's partly Indian, Native American, they're also partly Asian. And 23andMe tries to separate that. But we're trying to create categories and put people in those categories. But birth description is the first moment that is done, and then you act on it. Then you start treating people differently based on that category. So race is kind of one of the more ticklish things to deal with in American society. It's also one of the more ticklish things to deal with in California, and it is absolutely one of the most ticklish things to deal with in social science, because it's a really complicated thing. It is in part okay, I'm going to talk social science to you just for a second. It is a proxy for human variation. Let me say that in English. We know people are different from each other. They have different phenotypes, different structures. You know, look around this room. We're a great example of a very diverse set of phenotypes. Phenotypes means your physical expression from your genotype. So we look around we have different skin colors and different hair and different eyes and different body postures. When I live in China, and especially when I live in South China, I feel like some kind of monster because I am so big. And if I have to buy shoes while I'm living in China, I have to buy men's shoes because I have big honking feet. Now, for a Californian, I don't have big honking feet, but when I go to a different part of the world, the different human variation produces different clothing sizes. So there's a piece of us that just is different, and we don't want to deny that. We are physically different. But what do we ascribe? What do we attribute? What do we put on those physical differences? And that thing is race. So it is in part an expression of human variation, and it is in part an expression of our categories that we create linguistically, socially, legally, physically, in the way we treat each other. So race is this ticklish thing. And I asked a link to be sent to you that talks about race. I'm only going to drill down on one piece of race, which is skin color, which is quite fascinating. Because if you look at a map of the distribution of skin color, what do you see? I mean, it's a pretty intuitive map, as in the darker the people, the darker the color on the map. The lighter the people, the lighter the color on the map. So I think you can kind of get the big picture very quickly. What do you see? darkest people physically in the world, on the planet Earth. Little geoliteracy test here. The equator. So all along the equator, where the sun is the hottest, strongest, you see people being much darker. And then as they get to where the sun gets weaker and paler and more feeble, what happens to people's skin color? It lightens up. And why is that the case? Now, if we look at the evolution of skin color, and this has been a lot of detailed work in the last 10 years to really look at this, I would say that we actually really thoroughly understood it at a fairly deep level until relatively recently. But the quick story is that you need sunlight to produce vitamin D, and if you don't, in your body, and metabolize that, metabolize your vitamin D, and if you don't get it, you get a really dreadful disease called rickets. And you can do a quick Google image on rickets and watch some people who are kind of very, I mean, they're kind of, their legs are like this, but you know, you look at that and you go, so what? So they've got both legs. Well, the other thing that happens is that the women have a distorted pelvis. So, where do babies come from? Babies come from the pelvis. So if you have a pelvis that's distorted, are you going to have good babies? Healthy babies? No, you're going to have problems. So if you are not physically adapted for the sunlight band to which you exist, you're going to have some really big problems. So as people migrated out of our source continent for the human race, which was what continent did we all come from? All of us. Africa, out of Africa. So as we migrated out of Africa, what happened to our skin colors? We moved north and south. We paled up. Because if we didn't pale up, you couldn't have babies. The babies wouldn't live. And if you don't have babies, that means the people with darker skin just didn't have babies that lived. And it doesn't take that many thousands of years to have a fairly concrete evolutionary experience with skin color. And that is the basis for why we all are in the various shades of brown that we are. That's one primary reason for that. And it's a very pragmatic and practical reason. So human variation, very biological, very scientific. We can kind of understand the biological basis for that. What have we done with that information? Is it neutral? Do we say, oh, I see that your ancestors came from a band of longitude and latitude that would allow you to have mildly brown skin. Oh, I see that your ancestors came from one that was a little closer to the equator. Do we just say that?
No.
No, we have created cultural categories that allow us to judge each other. And the reasons for that are fascinatingly historical, so that if you look at the website link that I sent Michael Randall, and that you guys could look at, that is from the American Anthropological Association, you'll get to see how the exciting history of colonialism allowed us to create these categories which made the people who were pale feel very good about trying to control the people who were not. And that there was a historical reason for the creation of an ideology that said light-skinned people are better than dark-skinned people. That was a historical creation. We created that. It's a cultural construction. But it's a cultural construction about a biological phenomenon. So we want to think about, we create all these differences that matter. And as social scientists, we ask, why have we made these differences matter? What is it about our societies that kind of puts us in the place where we judge each other? Who benefits from that judging? For example, in the United States historically, the creations of racism had a whole lot to do with who was enslaved about 3.5 centuries ago. That there were two main populations enslaved by the early English. One of those populations came from Africa, and the other population came from, not hearing it yet. I'm not hearing it yet. It's not quite, it's near Britain. I'm sorry, my accent stinks, so it's no clue at all.
Ireland.
Ireland, thank you. We enslaved the Irish, yes. And did we want the Irish and the Africans to gang up together and overthrow the people that said that they owned them when they were outnumbered? No. So an ideology was created that pitted one against another. So we've got this cultural construction that is rooted in power. So when we think about these biological differences, we want to think about who benefited from the creation of these cultural constructs about biological phenomena. Who benefits from thinking women are weaker? Who benefits from thinking that blacks are inferior? Who benefits from thinking that short people have nobody to love? These are cultural categories that we all play with. So one of the ideas I want to throw at you is that, and this is an idea that anthropologists steal quite happily from the social psychologists. So Bob Cooper, thank you for all the work that your discipline does for mine. We create schema. Now schema are frameworks in our thinking that help us organize thoughts. So it's embedded in our language, it's embedded in the kinds of images we have. A schema, for example, I introduced a schema to you that if you live in a built environment like a city, you understand lines and proportions and dimensions better than if you were raised in a hut. You have different cultural schema about the world. If you live in a society where men and women are almost equal, like the Hadza, which is an example of a population, a hunting-gathering population in Africa in which they're almost equal, you will have different schema about the power of women and men than you will if you come from here, or any number of places where men and women are dramatically different in how they're assessed. So one of the things I want you to understand as a concept is that we all have these schema about identity, about our categories, the groups of people we put into those categories, and how we judge those categories. And that's a really important thing to understand about yourself and about other human beings. It isn't that they're all rat asses. It isn't that they're all douche nozzles. It is that sorry, I'm the parent of a teenager. Those things come naturally to me. But it is that we have created these structures of power that tend to replicate themselves. You learn them at your parents' knee. You learn them in the media. You learn them in virtually every interaction around you. And those structures of power reinforce these schema. So if you take one word away from you today, it's cultural schema. Cultural schema organize our thinking. They organize it about nearly everything. So you have schema about people and schema about things. And I want you to understand that one of the most powerful cultural schema, and I think they're doing the countdown on me right now, so I know I only have a couple minutes, is ancestral identity. That you get your identity from your parents, from your ancestors. So it would be really weird if someone decided to assert, say, a racial identity that wasn't a parent's racial identity. That somehow seems wrong to us. And I want us to understand that that too is a schema. I mean, why should your identity come from your parents? I mean, why can't you choose your identity? It's because we are used to the idea that ancestral identity is the way identity is made. That's our schema. That's our default position. And I want us to consider what other kinds of identities can exist. What kinds of identities can be created and by what? Because those are part of this larger debate on nature and nurture and fit very well in with the kinds of questions you're being asked. And I'll leave it with the last slide, in preparation for next week's panel debate on why anthropologists tend to be just a little uncomfortable with nature-nurture dichotomies, because how do you look at things which are partly natural and partly the result of learning? How do you take that and separate that out? Isn't your capacity to create schema biological? You're human beings with brains that are a function of your biology, that are a function of long generations of evolution that have given you the capacity to create schema. So, wait a minute, that capacity is itself inherited. It's part of you. It's part of, I'm not going to ever use the phrase human nature. You will not catch me doing it. But it's part of what we are as a species. But it means that we can be something else, something we choose to be as well. Okay, I think that's it.